Sehr geehrte Frau Guerrero, Exzellenzen,
Ms. Guerrero, Excellencies,
sehr geehrten Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen,
vielen Dank, dass Sie gekommen
thank you
sind.
very much for coming.
Frau Guerrero, mit dieser Koinzidenz mit dem heutigen
Well,
Tag bin ich nicht
the
ganz so
timing
glücklich.
of today's
lieber,
conference,
wir
I'm not
hätten
so
nur
happy
die
with it. I would
Konferenz
prefer just to have the conference and not the pressure of decision-making about the problems with Greece.
Was übrigens der Grund ist, warum ich leider
And that's the reason why, unfortunately, I have to excuse Mr. Moscovici, who I think is busy preparing the assessment of the offer from the Greek government. So I'm very sorry that he can't be with us here today, but I think we're all very interested in what's going to transpire there. And then Mr. Timmermans will be coming later on, and we will indeed have an exciting conference. And I would like to start by thanking the staff of this ministry who really have some project work on Europe, and we said a few months ago that the Economic Affairs Ministry must focus on the future of Europe in greater depth, not only on the current issues, where people keep on asking us to make comments and assessments, but rather we should ourselves try to develop an idea of what is needed in future European development. So I'd like to thank those in the ministry very much who worked so hard on preparing this, and this is a mixture of internal preparation and political motivation, trying to encourage people outside also to focus more on this issue. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the great European Mr. Delors said once, you can't fall in love with a single market. And he warned us that the people in Europe would turn their backs on Europe if they couldn't see anything more in Europe than a common market. And if these economic benefits only actually benefit part of Europe, and lots of other people in Europe get the impression that Europe is not exactly helping their economic development, if not even impeding it, then they're not going to fall in love with Europe. And for many decades it was different. When people looked at Europe, they looked with a sense of hope, they thought of increasing prosperity, particularly in the first decades after the Second World War, when it was important to stabilize the peace. But since the financial and economic crisis, we've been confronted with the fact that this picture has become more difficult in many European member states, and this country, which has profited so much for European unification and is still doing, not only in political but also not only the political and cultural beneficiaries, but also the economic beneficiaries of Europe. There's a myth in Germany that we are bearing the burden in Germany and that all the evil comes from Europe. There's a really bad misrepresentation of the European development for Germany. Now, Jacques Delors' warning was correct at the time. I think it's now a question of the survival of Europe. We need to think about how Europe can mean more than just a single market. When people talk about Europe today, they're not thinking so much about peace and reconciliation, they're not thinking about freedom and emancipation, nor are they thinking about the common development of security and prosperity, but rather people think about financial markets, rescue packages, stability mechanisms, debt rescheduling, and a general feeling of uncertainty. None of these terms, while they may be necessary in terms of crisis management, actually really meet the everyday needs of people in Europe. They don't understand these sort of concepts. Maybe they trust in what's being done actually works, but basically they live at a great distance from these concepts, So for years now we've been talking about billions of rescue packages, billions of euros in rescue packages and stopping banks from collapsing, but there's no money to refurbish a school around the corner or to pay people a fair wage despite their hard work. Now, a major concept of a large continent seems to have been shrunk together to how to cope with a debt crisis. The debate about Europe, which used to be a debate of political ideas, currently is a business agenda. So Europe is still much more than that. It's more than a euro, it's more than a common market, it's more than the contract, the treaties and the institutions which keep Europe together today. Rather, for me, Europe today remains a unique idea of coexistence between peoples and nations. I can remember how my grandmother sang songs about the arch enemies in France, and Poland for my father were the Polacks, and we regarded it as liberating as children at home to get out of this climate and to have school partnerships with Britain and France, that we had the possibility to look across to a different world, which was completely new to us. Europe was a sort of liberation, a personal liberation for us from these old nationalistic concepts, which many people grew up with in my generation. And as we grew up, we had the security and peace and stability in Europe over a longer period. I'm from the generation which, for the first time, was able to be born in peace in Europe and to grow up, apart from the terrible conflict in Ukraine at the moment, at least in the part of Europe I live with, will die in peace in Europe. At least it looks that way. This is unprecedented. No previous generation has had this. My grandparents, my parents experienced at least one, if not two, wars in Europe, and war was the norm for them. And if I tell my daughter we don't need war, we need Europe so not to have war against France, she thinks it's very strange. Firstly, because she can't imagine the French will march in here, and secondly, because she likes visiting her friends in Paris. So it's normality now. And we can see in the Ukraine conflict that where the European Union's ability to create peace does not work, that this creates disasters. And probably the greatest civilizational process of the recent years and decades is that Europe has given us peace, and this is based on coexistence of people. And so the European idea places common good over individual interests. The European idea places cultural diversity over the compulsion to adapt. So the sustainable development takes precedence over exploitation of people and nature. Also, it creates cooperation over power. There's hardly any continent whose history is so dominated by battles for freedom, emancipation, democracy and the rule of law as our continent. And that's why I think you're right to say that, yes. Of course. I don't know, you're a boy or girl? One of the two, I think. Anyway, we're talking about your generation. When we talk about Europe, so you can experience what we experienced in Europe. The lessons from this, not just for economic reasons, are that the foundations on what European unification is based. And I think we need to revitalize the European idea, to remember there's more than just a few concepts of business economics, but rather is a project of political progress. And progress is not technical in nature, but progress in Europe has always been greater freedom, greater democracy, and greater social cohesion. That is European progress. It's more than a common market, and it's more than a social project, a societal project in which a few states got together and created a currency. Societies and people should be brought together, and there should be a social contract between the citizens of Europe which creates peace and prosperity and freedom and social security over the long term. And it's important to say this right at the beginning of this conference, because whilst the debate about investment and growth and employment is while that's important, and while Europe can make a great contribution here, the road towards a strong Europe does not lead only through economic strength, but it is also based on the recollection and the continuation of this European idea of coexistence. And I believe that we need to raise this European awareness in everyday life so that people can experience it in their everyday lives without having to agree again on what the project began as. And if we don't agree on these principles again, then we won't see a continuation of the European idea. So, at the same time, we have a great need for reforms. And we have seen many reforms over the last few years. Now, with the introduction of the banking union, we're getting much more financial market stability. We've got the new European semester to improve and coordinate the budget policies of the member states. And this went hand in hand with economic policy coordination. And the reforms of the Stability and Growth Pact, particularly the recent reforms, show that this pact is not only about stability or austerity, but also about growth. For a long time, the pact was only called a Stability Pact. In the public debate, it was always called the Stability Pact. The name was always Stability and Growth Pact. So it's a question of growth and employment, wages and salaries, and social security. And the new guidelines of the European Commission for 2015 show this very clearly. They talk about the application of the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact in order to interlink necessary structural reforms in the member states with investment and fiscal responsibility to boost employment and growth. Now, for us in Germany, this is an important debate. If we're honest, we too pretended that saving, austerity is the most important task, even though our own experience in Germany has been that structural reforms need to go hand in hand with investment and growth. In the interesting debate in Germany, most people say in 2003, 2 states in Europe violated the Maastricht borrowing criteria, and that was the beginning of the failure of Europe and the debt problems. That's the sort of political debate you get in Germany. But the truth is that in 2003, there were 2 different things that happened. Yes, it's true that 2 states in Europe violated the Maastricht criteria, Germany and France, but there was a big difference. In Germany, this went in hand with the social reforms, the Agenda 2010 reforms. And in France, it went in hand with nothing. In France, they kept on making more debts. In Germany, the country's investment policy, which didn't save an extra 20 billion euros in the federal budget, which should have done to adhere to the Maastricht criteria. We didn't do that because at the same time we were introducing some pretty contentious labour market reforms of the Agenda 2010, and we invested the money in research and development and education and in public infrastructure and renewable energies. Germany took an approach in which we combined structural reforms with investment. My impression is that the economic success of Germany as a consequence shows that the people who did it were right. But whereas France simply took on more debts, and didn't undertake the urgently needed labour market and structural reforms, and therefore is exposed to far more difficulties and pressures today to impose those reforms than it was at the time. I say that because I think this is a lesson in general for the European Union. We need to do what the Commission is proposing now, in other words, to be tough about structural reform, but at the same time to create scope for investment. That is the idea behind the flexibility of the Stability and Growth Pact, and I'm glad that what was regarded as high treason a year ago in this economic debate has now become a normal part of policymaking in Europe. However, of course, we now need to create some substance behind it. I think that dispensing with investment and growth would have meant that the reforms in Germany would not have worked either. My assumption is that if at the time we had done the Agenda 2010 structural reforms, but also cut 20 billion from the federal budget and the investment, then the public resistance would have been so great that probably we wouldn't have got either, neither the fiscal consolidation nor the structural reforms. And therefore, I believe that the two things belong together. The new guidelines from the Commission are an expression of this twin-track strategy with which the European Union wants to master the economic and fiscal challenges. In the years since the massive crisis in 2008, and the subsequent debt crisis in the European Union, we've learned quite a lot. We've learned that we need to have the rules on cutting debts more binding, but we've also learned that nobody can really save to cope with a long-lasting recession. We've learned that a downward spiral of debt and so on results in higher social costs and mass unemployment, and this weakens Europe in economic and political terms. And the latest development is that it turns into anti-European populism. So we've drawn some conclusions from this lesson. In June 2012, Europe adopted the Pact for Stability and Growth, for growth and employment, but it took a long time before it actually bore fruit. But gradually, everybody has understood that we can only cope with the debt crisis if the fiscal consolidation goes hand in hand with a policy for sustainable growth, and I should add, for investment in competitiveness. Not new stimulus packages, not the third highway next to the two that's already been paid for with European money, which nobody's driving along, but rather in competitiveness, for example, by expanding the digital infrastructure through energy efficiency, through research and development. And I think it's a disgrace for a high-tech region like Europe that we're not in a position to develop a battery, our own battery, for e-mobility. It can't be true that we are making our whole e-mobility industry on batteries which are made elsewhere in the world. We must succeed in developing our own batteries in Europe. Also, we need active political intervention to stimulate the forces for growth and to tackle unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, effectively. I think the causes of populism and for people turning away from Europe are diverse, but 26 million people are unemployed in Europe, and we can't cope with that in the long term. Millions of young people who, unlike me, don't view Europe as a hope, but as a threat to their own future. And we can't really explain that 2 years ago, we provided 6 billion euros to tackle youth unemployment, and for the first year and a half, only one country made use of this program. I think now 3 countries are making use of this program, and people aren't using the money. And at the same time, people are calling for more money. It can't be true. It can't be right that where we create the funding of that people aren't able to absorb the funding and make sensible instruments out of it. Now, the strategy and employment and growth strategy is, of course, also focused on involving the financial sector in the cost of the crisis. And there's not only an economic reason for this, but also there's a moral reason for this. The argument behind it is that, on the one hand, it was just about possible to explain why taxpayer has to spend billions on stabilizing banks and rescuing banks who got into problems because of their conduct on the financial markets. But then, when they make billions of profits again, nobody contributes at least a part to reducing the debts. Nobody in Europe can understand that. There's an old market principle. Risk and liability belong together. And if we weren't in a position then to resolve the problems without the taxpayers' help, then now we must be in a position at least to get part of these massive profits on the financial markets and use them to pay off the debts that we entered into to cope with the financial crisis. Surely that's a question of moral and political hygiene in Europe. If we don't do that, then we will not be able to persuade people in Europe of the European idea. Well, hesitant applause shows I haven't convinced everybody. But if we started with the financial transaction tax, and we've made some more progress over the last few weeks. It looks as though we can finally overcome the differences between member states on financial market regulation. There's no point in complaining every day that people are moving away from Europe if we do not show in our policies that we are able to respond to people's feelings of fairness, of what is fair in Europe. And if we have a financial transaction tax, we at last have the opportunity to give the EU more funding so that it can actually stimulate investment and growth. Nor would the financial transaction tax be a tax for the member states. I assume the people in my party, the minister-president of the Länder, are not quite so enthusiastic if they were encouraged to make the money available for Europe. But nevertheless, I think that if we're serious about this, that we really want to invest in Europe's competitiveness, then the financial transaction tax must gradually become a European tax, because that's where the funding has to be deployed, and not only be a normal tax to us. I think rather we need more and not less Europe here. This also applies to tax dumping. It's a question of fairness, of moral and ethical principles. If you have a bakery in Berlin, I can't explain to you why you, the baker, pay higher tax rates than, say, Starbucks and Amazon and Google and so on. That cannot be right. The people who create the value added in Germany, who can't leave Germany because their business structure is such that they can't go to a low-tax country in Europe, that they are at a structural disadvantage and a long-term disadvantage compared with large companies who can exploit the tax dumping in Europe. And therefore, I'm glad that Wolfgang Schäuble, at the G20 level, but also in Europe, is trying at least to get minimum standards about what we tax and what we don't tax. So the investment package of the European Commission has taken up the proposal of Jean-Claude Juncker about setting up a European Fund for Strategic Investment, which can be up to 315 billion euros, and this can really be a catalyst for economic developments in Europe. So this is the second part of the Stability and Growth Pact. If we succeed in giving a genuine stimulus for more growth and employment, then this will help us to make the European idea more attractive again. I think that we need to broaden this debate as well and ask ourselves why, if we have a stability and growth pact where we're very precise about cutting deficits and pretty general about how to promote growth. I see Mr. Endlein there at the front. You'll be talking with him about his ideas of a minimum turnover investment, a minimum level of investment going all the time. So that it's not only clear that what happens on the stability side, that we have clear yardsticks for budget deficits, but we also have clear yardsticks for investment in growth. Right through to the question as to whether this is linked with structural reforms, and secondly, there has to be the condition that there have to be investments in European competitiveness, and thirdly, it should be possible to take up an extra 0.5% of debt in order to invest in competitiveness if at the same time structural reforms are undertaken and the investment only goes into enhancing European competitiveness. I think this is a debate which we need to have, because it's good to have the specific details in the Stability and Growth Pact on the stability side, but we need more details on the growth side. We need investment in European competitiveness and growth, for example, in expanding digital infrastructure, as I said, also in the energy market. In particular, the new fund must be supplementary. It cannot be right that countries, Germany for example, that just report all the things that they always wanted to do at home. I think we need tough criteria for what the investment will go into, and Germany will be providing 8 billion via the KfW in order to further expand this program. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm confident that we can also solve the second major problem we have, and that is the debate about the developments in Greece. Just let me give you a few figures so that we get a better, more balanced assessment of the Greek situation. People in the German public arena aren't aware that Greece has made substantial progress over the last few years on fiscal consolidation. A primary surplus of 0.8% of GDP and growth of 0.6% after 6 years of recession last year. So Greece has cut its primary expenditure from 104 in 2010 to 79 last year, so it's roughly by 30%, so I can't imagine how much we would have to cope with in Germany if we had even to do half of that. So over the last 4 years, the budget deficit in terms of GDP has fallen from 11.1% to 1.6%. The primary balance without interest rate payments in 2014 was 2.7% of GDP. It was actually a surplus of roughly 5 billion euros. So I think this should also be mentioned in public, because often people pretend that Greece hasn't done anything. But what we also need to say is that the contributions which the citizens in Greece have to make towards this were much higher than the contributions which we had to make in our social reforms. The Agenda 2010, compared with what the Greeks have been doing for some years, really was a breath of warm air. Wage and salaries down 45%, pensions too. And of course there's a massive gap in fairness in Greece, not only in Greece, but also when we see about the rules on state aids and tax evasion and so on in other European countries as well. I hope that the Greek government is really serious about cutting corruption and graft, and that really it will stick to its reform programs. And it's also important to remember that the problems in Greece weren't caused by the European Union or the Troika, but by the nepotism and the corruption in Greece. For decades, the people in Greece were really exploited by their political and economic elites. And they set up two parties of this, a conservative and I'm afraid also a social democratic party. And those two parties exploited the country and the people. And that's why I believe that the new Greek government really does have a chance to tackle tax evasion and corruption, and the other member states should particularly support Greece as it tries to do this. For example, when you have serious tax crimes, it's important that their accounts in other European countries are also frozen until all the people in Greece pay the tax they're supposed to pay. Also, it means that the Greek tax authorities and prosecution authorities also need to give us that information. It's also important to have a better burden sharing, and still the sad reality that the distribution of wealth in Greece is some of the most unfair in Europe. The younger people in Europe know a good system for redistributing wealth. For example, we have the redistribution of burdens in Germany after the Second World War. The people who had a lot after the Second War gave up things for some of their wealth so that the millions of refugees who came across into Germany from Eastern Europe could be coped with, who had lost everything. So this sort of thing would be a sensible supplement to the programs that Europe has already made for Greece. We certainly want Greece to remain in the Eurozone, not because there's no alternative, but because it's the right thing to do, in order to safeguard Greece's political and economic future. And I think that what we are seeing now is that after major problems at the beginning, the Greek government is very much willing to recognize that fairness is not a one-way street, and nor a solidarity. We want to continue the aid for Greece, but the precondition is that it continues its reform programs. Each government has the right to change its policies, but the financial repercussions of a changed policy have to be borne within the country itself. They cannot be shared with other European countries. So I'm cautiously optimistic that today and on Friday we'll gradually move towards a resolution of this conflict. Well, ladies and gentlemen, important reforms and steps towards integration have often been top-down in Europe, and this is probably not wrong in principle, but we need to ensure that there's more bottom-up integration between the member states. And that was the basic idea of the Schengen Agreement almost 30 years ago. You will recall that originally 5 of the 10 EU member states at the time signed it, and it is now anchored in European law. And it's also being expanded to cover almost all of Europe. Schengen is a European success story from the bottom to the top, also for the citizens. And therefore, I think it makes sense to think about an economic Schengen, wherever you need modernization, integration, in order to promote European competitiveness. We can reduce unnecessary barriers between states, and we're trying to do that now in this ministry with our electric neighbors. Some of them are not direct neighbors, but we have power lines going to Sweden and Norway. We're trying to set up this sort of legal framework to ensure energy security between the countries here. I'm sure that Germany and France can play a key role here, and therefore I've talked with my French counterparts, with Mr. Macron, Mr. Enderlein, Mr. Jean Pisani-Ferry. I've been working on an economic Schengen with these people. The proposals from Mr. Enderlein and Pisani-Ferry aim at cooperation in major areas of investment, such as vocational skills and digital agenda and energy. And we want to push ahead with these in the European context, but we are firmly convinced that we need better regulatory and political cooperation on energy, vocational training, skills, and the digital agenda will create new prospects for us and also provide an incentive for others to join us in these efforts. Like with the end of the border controls, we can work close together here. In the Schengen Agreement, we saw that how the cooperation between a few member states, which began 30 years ago, grew into an important step towards integration. And with the necessary will, the countries will be able to reduce impediments to movement as they did with Schengen many years ago. Well, ladies and gentlemen, despite all the day-to-day political disputes in the EU, sometimes it's worth taking a step back and remembering what Europe can achieve when we don't argue, but we show solidarity. Europe, Robert Schuman said, will create from actual facts, which creates solidarity of the act. And he was right, and I think there's a lot of ways ahead of us to show that we can really act in solidarity, that we are able and willing to do so, to act in solidarity, and we hope very much that this conference will give us a further stimulus to show us how to do so. Thank you very much for coming, and I wish you every success and a lot of good ideas which we can then steal and use in our policies. If you want, we're willing to go in for give you a copyright as well, but that's what we need. We need good ideas for Europe. Thank you very much.